Welcome, Bruchim Abbayim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together. Before I jump in, it is worth acknowledging that there are about 9,000 ways to incorrectly have this discussion, and perhaps 2 or 3 right ways to have it, which is why this discussion isn't probably what you think it's going to be. At least for the most part, for good or for ill, deserved or not, the second that you saw the word cannabis in the title of this chapter, you have probably already had an emotional reaction, one way or the other. Yay! Or boo! Which has led to curiosity or anger. And if we could please take a second to breathe and be honest, you don't know what I'm going to say or why I would choose to even think of addressing something that is still, for many, highly controversial, which is part of the meta point in making the decision to proceed rather than delete last minute and insert a nice, comfortable chapter on something much more kumbaya. A few years ago, in an online for rabbis only discussion forum that shall not be named, I had a reminder that the evolving opinions in some parts of the world regarding any discussion of cannabis, from medical use to recreational, were not universally shared. I personally grew up in a household where there was no nuanced discussion of the subject, which reflected my personal, unchallenged opinion for most of my life, so the reactions should not have surprised me. In the forum, around Hanukkah time, someone posted a Chanukia, a Hanukkah menorah, made in the form of a bong. Some light humor, pun definitely intended for the holiday, and while most people reacted with like and laughter emojis, several thoughtful and respected colleagues, good people can disagree with each other, were outraged. And even though this was generally a progressive forum, the opinions that decried the humorous posting sounded much more like the influential response written decades ago by ultra-Orthodox Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Allowing for no other interpretation, discussion, or opinion, Feinstein writes that, quote, "It is obviously forbidden to smoke marijuana," unquote, given the reasons of physical and mental harm. He then continues that, quote, "This is a terrible thing," unquote, as under the influence one can neither study Torah nor perform the mitzvot. After commenting on issues of addiction, he uses the formulation, quote, "This is a very grave prohibition." So yes, I understand that this topic should not be entered into lightly as well. Simultaneously, some will be annoyed that I am catering to certain views and treading lightly.
Hey, just stop dancing around and let's talk about this, Rabbi.
While others will not want me to approach this in any way.
How dare you talk about this, Rabbi?
But you see, there is a problem, at least if we are trying to come at this from a Jewish standpoint. Part of what makes Judaism is this silly habit that rabbis have had for the last couple millennia of discussing all topics regardless of how controversial they are. This is because life, when looked at honestly and without those rose-colored glasses, tends to get splotches of mud and reality on it. We hurt people. We harm ourselves. We state motivations to justify actions that are clear lies to ourselves and others. And when those actions start stepping on other people's rights and obligations, there are people in society that act in ways that uplift people, and others, for a myriad of reasons, that work tirelessly to tear people down and then, of course, justify this. Add to that the basic sociological principle, known as the Dunbar line, that more than about 150 people cannot live in a community without a meta-narrative to tie them together, and you have a lot of folks over a lot of years discussing a lot of things because most of society is formed of groups over 150, which means our default mode is not going to be getting along. Surprise, surprise! Within Judaism, much of this dialogue is captured in the Talmud, and as humans have opinions, and these as well are not always elevated, some of those captured opinions and discussions elevate and some miss the mark. They're still all captured for a reason. But much like that the Torah is filled with flawed people that reflect what it actually means to be human, the dialogic foundations of rabbinical Judaism capture what it means to argue about pretty much anything that might have an effect on society around them. When we discuss what is really happening around us, the discussion can get quite uncomfortable. And although it seems I have not yet in this several-minute point even begun to discuss cannabis, this is, of course, exactly what I've been doing all along. If cannabis has become more and more a part of mainstream discussion, the fear of discussing cannabis from the perspectives of Jewish history, law, and practice is a type of rabbinical malpractice. It is not a rabbi's job any more than any spiritual or religious leader's job to make us comfortable, primarily. Sorry, folks, there is no spiritual evolution without discomfort. The spiritual leader's job is to help make us more aware, and the special rabbinical flavor adds on top of this the requirement to have that discussion within the additional context of law, practice, and meaning via interpretation. Closing our eyes and demanding that the world around me conforms to my box is as dangerous as demanding ideological changes in religion because of something that I alone personally find useful. Both are small picture activities in a religion that has against all probability survived because of its interest in a much bigger picture, including open discussion, disagreement, and allowing opinions, multiple opinions, to be in the same room as we are, even if we are offended. So now diving right into the butt of it, the reason that we are here this week in the first place is a pesky little word that may or may not be correctly translated in the Torah recipe for anointing oil. In Parashat Tisa, we read, "The Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, 'Next, take choice spices, 500 weight of solidified myrrh, half as much, 250 of fragrant cinnamon, 250 of Cannabis, 500 by sanctuary weight of cassia, and a hin of olive oil.'" In modern times, the first salvo in the "Has cannabis ever been a part of Jewish ritual battles" came from a Polish anthropologist, Sula Bennett, who in the first part of the 20th century made the claim that Cannabis, usually translated as sweet calamus or sweet cane, etymologically refers to cannabis. Cannabis, cannabis. Even at the surface, the similarity seems possible. And this is where we get to the problems. Whether or not Dr. Bennett's claims are compelling or not to the various commentators on her assertions has little to do with her arguments and nearly everything to do with the pre-formed perspective of the person reading her article, Early Diffusion and Folk Uses of Hemp. Let's be brutally honest for a second. Someone like Moshe Feinstein, of blessed memory, reading this article would disagree a priori, no questions, and a person that uses the Bangukia on Hanukkah will agree. Before a single word has been read, a single claim analyzed, and a single source contradicting the prefabricated perspective regarded. Both sides, both perspectives of a debate do the exact same thing. This is, in a nutshell, how the chasm of tribalism deepens. We don't want discussion. We don't even want information. We just want confirmation. Here is what we do know. Hemp has been found in Eretz Israel in the archaeological digs that date to the time at least of the Second Temple, roughly 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. Put simply, if the non-psychotropic male plant producing the hemp exists, then so will the psychotropic producing female plant. Whether used or not, it is there in that place and time. It was known. That is still a long way from this being proof that Cannabis was used in the sacred anointing oil. And of course, even if we were to find the smoking gun, or smoking bong, of direct cannabis use by Jews in that area in that time, a find in a house would not point to proof of ritual use. Surprisingly for some, Judaism for quite some time has been quite aware of marijuana itself, as the word is even captured, cannabis, in multiple times, in multiple discussions in the 16th century Shulchan Aruch, the single most authoritative codex of Jewish law ever. It's not like this discussion began with Nixon and Normal and that Jews suddenly discovered in 2017 that such a thing existed. So let's play a game of what if, followed by what if not. Let's say that the Cannabis in the anointing oil first used for the tabernacle and then the priesthood and finally for the anointing of kings was indeed cannabis. More specifically, a sativa strain that would be likely to grow in the geographical area of Eretz Israel. Turning the measurements in our Torah verses into ones that make sense to our current understanding, this sacred mixture would have been an infusion of solid spices into about a gallon of olive oil, just under 4 liters. That's roughly 9 pounds, or 4-ish kilos of solid cannabis, in addition to the quite aromatic all of the rest, infused into that oil. Now, we don't know what the process was, but just generally speaking, in preparation for the discussion, I did approach some people that scientifically work with these substances and asked how much oil would be needed to get a contact high. I was given the answer, a couple of drops. How much oil would be poured over the head of a Judean king to anoint them? A lot more. The entire passage of King David danced after he was anointed king seems to take on a completely different tenor in this perspective. When we read the Tanakh, we read it by backward projecting what we know to be true, onto a people, culture, and yes, even religion that, were we to be transported back in time, would scarcely resemble a single thing we do in our shuls today. Dare I say, what we discovered might even make us uncomfortable. Therefore, when we read passages like, David whirled with all his might before the eternal, do we really visualize what that might look like, that intensity of expression that would bring about those words? The text says that he did this wearing an ephod, a priestly apron, and his wife Michal's reaction and attempt at shaming of David make it clear that this was all he was wearing. What am I saying? Well, not much more than, do we actually read these passages? Do we acknowledge? Are we willing to acknowledge that even our earliest texts contain much that we have not absorbed or contemplated? And what about the first anointed king, Saul, Shaul HaMelech? Go back and read or reread the passages where Saul merely gets near prophets, speaking ecstatically, and begins to do so himself, going to extremes that would shock us if we're not only reading the passages but contemplating them. I'll put a link down below to one of the passages. Read to the end of chapter 19. What am I suggesting? Primarily, only that the Tanakh contains a lot of stuff we don't think about because we don't want to be challenged to see not only the evolution of our tradition, but as well that the evolutionary sources of our tradition would not comfortably fit into our niece's bat mitzvah. Even without substances involved, had we wandered onto the Temple Mount during a service, we would not be met with a dignified reading of the Siddur in the vernacular. Rather, we would have something more akin to a rock festival with lights. I didn't say Woodstock. Intense smells of massive amounts of incense, choirs of Levites with every sort of instrument available at the same time, singing and playing in potentially complex modes and rhythms, audience participation with responsive chants of psalms, all with a heightened sense of awe and mystery for the grand temple right there, acting as the backdrop for all of this. Those of us that think services are or should be boring have missed tying into the theatricality at the core of our tradition. What I'm suggesting is that our religion has evolved profoundly. That includes our sense of morality, which includes such things as proper use or use at all of psychotropic and or psychedelic substances. Does that mean in any way that I'm suggesting that if we could prove that cannabis meant cannabis, that we should add certain substances to our daily rituals? Honestly, no. As once again, our tradition has evolved to its place today, and what was needed for one time is not necessarily what is ritually important for another. Do we really want to return to animal sacrifice, for example? What I am suggesting is that a relationship with Judaism using the fullness of our intellectual capacity, something that I believe is absolutely required in our tradition, involves wrestling with the incontrovertible fact that the whole picture of Judaism, that any of us as an individual allows to be Judaism, in our perspective, is only a part of what is or has been Judaism. The iterative and ongoing question that should be demanded of ourselves in this reality is, what happens when I encounter an aspect of someone else's expression of Judaism that makes me feel uncomfortable, that I don't know, that I've never seen before, that's not part of what I got growing up or in my process of conversion? I'm not talking about the person that has a vision and says, we now need to merge with the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster and replace all our yarmulkes with colanders. That's my Judaism and you have to accept it. No, I'm talking about what has been captured, interpreted, discussed, and ritualized in the 3 millennia of institutional Judaism, as well as the parallel fascinating paths of folk Judaism. In those buckets are contained ecstatic practice, men and women sitting both apart and together, Abraham serving the angels non-kosher food, music we don't like, and yes, perhaps even the use of substances whose discussion today is highly problematic in many circles. Acknowledging the existence or potential existence of these variables is not the same as advocating. Refusing to acknowledge them, however, is what drives us to look at another without compassion and say that they don't belong because they don't do it our way or understand it our way. Ask folks that have left forever brick and mortar shuls why they're no longer there, and you will find that story far too often. If our ancestors built our tradition partially because of moments of alternative perspective caused by substances that short-circuit the forced quasi-rationality of daily life, then there is a discussion to be had regarding what to do and what tools are available if we are stuck in our perspectives, unable to change our minds, must always be right, and need some help stepping back into a place of shalom with those with whom we disagree and thus have ended relationships. Is Kane Bosom the answer? Even if I was sure what it was, I'm not wise enough to answer that question. Something outside the box of our comfort, however, probably is the answer, and that meditation technique, ecstatic dance, normal prayer life, or perhaps even substance is worth a few minutes of contemplation, if only to learn a little about why we are stuck and why for so many things we react so strongly. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. See you next time.
בחצות זרות וקול שופר הריעו לפני המלך אדוני